Welcome to State of the State. I'm Darlene DeRezzo, and I'm in conversation with Vanessa Volz. She is the Executive Director of Sojourner House. We are continuing our series on mental health awareness, as May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on in. Let's start with your journey to Sojourner House. What would you like to share maybe about your personal life, your professional life that led you to this position?
So I am not a native Rhode Islander, but I moved here after I finished law school, and I took a job with a nonprofit, and I was doing civil rights, disability discrimination work. And I enjoyed the work, but my passion has really always been women's rights advocacy. And I became involved in some other organizations. I was doing some pro bono work for some family law, pro bono work, some advocacy work at the State House. And I met an attorney who was on the board at Sojourner House. And at the time, they were looking for a new executive director. And I had a law degree. I did not have a lot of nonprofit administrative experience, but I somehow was at the right place at the right time. And I became the director of the agency 12 years ago.
Wow.
And at that time, Sojourner House was a very small organization. When I started with them, we had 11 staff members and 1 shelter. And over time, we've grown and expanded in different ways. Several years ago, we started really focusing on permanent supportive housing as a bridge to help individuals and families once their crisis had stabilized. And so once we moved in that direction, that opened up new funding streams. And so we're now at a place where we have 4 offices in different locations, and we've started acquiring property that we're using to provide supportive housing to victims and families. And there are over 55 staff members who work at Sojourner House, and we just have really gained a lot of momentum, and we're serving more people than ever before. Last year we served close to 2,000 unduplicated individuals through our advocacy work.
Wow. Okay, so the name Sojourner House, where does that come from?
So our namesake is Sojourner Truth. And so we were named in part in honor of her, and then also we were named with the idea of clients come to us and they're sojourning into a new chapter of their life. So this idea that we're offering a safe place for them to be as they rebuild.
So it was initially started as a shelter?
It was actually initially started as a hotline.
Oh,
so
wow.
It was a very small organization. We have our founding in a group of women who were students and faculty and staff at Brown University. This was in the 1970s. Sojourner House was established as a nonprofit here in Rhode Island in 1976. And at that time, the 70s, domestic violence as an issue was just starting to gain some kind of public awareness. But there weren't funding opportunities, there weren't a lot of models for how to provide programming to victims of domestic violence, so it was a very small operation at first. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the agency even had any kind of funding. So initially, the first few years of the organization, it was just run by volunteers, and they set up an emergency hotline, then they rotated coverage to provide emotional support over the phone to victims.
Wow. Okay. So what is domestic violence? I think that when people hear that, they might have an idea in their head. How would you define it?
So domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behaviors that we often talk about a continuum of behaviors. Rarely does someone exhibit abusive behaviors the first time someone meets them. And so it's often a pattern, and there are different types of abuse that someone might experience in a relationship or through an intimate partnership. Oftentimes, an abusive partner may begin by utilizing verbal or emotional abuse, and then over time it might become more psychological, physical, financial, sexual, and so it compounds over time. and it can take form in many different ways. A lot of times abuse happens in private and other people have no idea that a partner is being abusive, and oftentimes emotional abuse is a prevalent form of abuse. And so when a victim does seek support from their community, oftentimes they're told, oh, your partner would never do that. That person seems so great. And so it becomes this just this pattern of behavior that oftentimes other people don't even recognize.
Right. So abusers are not abusive 24/7.
Right.
They can be charming, right? They can also seem very nurturing and doting and adoring. And then you're right, it's hard for someone outside of maybe the household to see that, because they can present as, again, charming, charismatic, caring.
Well, and we often talk about cycles of abuse. So even within an intimate partner relationship, a partner might become abusive. There might be an explosion of some sort, something severe that happens, and the abusive partner might then immediately apologize and say, I will never do that again. That's not who I am. I would never do that. And then there might be a period, sometimes a long period, of non-abusive behavior, and so the person who's being abused thinks it's not going to happen again, and then it does happen again. And what we know over time is that oftentimes abuse becomes more severe the longer the relationship spans. But oftentimes an abuser is very apologetic and is very charismatic and promises it will never happen again. And the longer that someone's in a relationship with someone, it becomes more difficult to leave.
Why is it so difficult to leave?
For so many reasons. There are cultural reasons. Oftentimes, if someone marries a partner, they have pressure from their culture, their family, their church not to leave. There are financial implications. A lot of individuals that are in an abusive situation also experience financial abuse, and that's often a tactic that abusers use to exert power and control by controlling the finances. So it can become very difficult, especially if children are involved. So if a couple has children, then the person who's being abused is overly reliant on the abuser for financial support and for parenting support. It's very difficult, obviously, to be a single parent. And if an abuser has exerted control in a way that the person who's being abused doesn't have a community, doesn't have a network of support, they become very isolated, and then they have only their abusive partner to rely on. So then where else would they go? And that becomes an issue as well. Where would they go? If someone has been financially exploited and is dependent on their abuser for all of their financial and basic needs, then they don't have the means to pursue another safe place to go.
Yeah. What's the difference between privacy and secrecy?
What is the difference between privacy and secrecy? That is a good question. Oftentimes, an abuser will exhibit secretive behavior, which they encourage the person they're abusing not to talk about what is going on within their relationship. And certainly you can have privacy within a relationship, but when something becomes secretive and you don't feel comfortable talking about it because there's a negative aspect to it, then that can become problematic. And that is again a technique that abusers often use so that victims feel like they can't talk about what's going on in their relationship. And we notice that a lot in abusive relationships, that the victim winds up becoming very isolated from their family, from their support system, from their friends, and so they reach a point where even if they want to leave, they have no one to support them emotionally or practically if they need support.
And why do you think we often hear people blaming the victim? Why don't you leave?
Well, we live in a culture that likes to blame victims. It's something we see in a variety of different ways. I mean, everything from, I still hear a lot of comments about the way women dress, and are they asking for something by dressing provocatively? So there's this undercurrent in a lot of the way that our media even responds to the way people present themselves in our society. It's easy to blame the victim. It's the more that you do this work, though, the more you understand the complexity of domestic and sexual violence. The question I often ask is, how could someone leave that situation?
Right, and the question I ask is, why not stop abusing?
Exactly.
Why aren't we asking the abusers that? Stop abusing, why don't you leave?
Exactly. Well, that is the question we should be asking more so than why doesn't she leave?
Yep.
Or why don't leave? I mean, abuse can happen in all forms of relationships.
Okay, all right, so from a staff of 11 to a staff of 55 now, you want to talk about that journey? The programs that's developed?
Yes, so when I started with the agency 12 years ago, we really were focused on emergency interventions. We had a hotline, we had emergency shelter, and the idea was that if someone is in a dangerous situation or needs support in some way because of the abuse, that we would provide interventions, a safe, stable shelter, and supportive services. What we found over the years is that families and individuals would come to us in a crisis, and then their crisis would begin to stabilize. And I think we all would agree that an emergency shelter is not a long-term placement, especially for families, and 85% of the clients who come to us have small children with them. And what we were seeing is that a lot of families would come to us, stay in our shelter, but then have nowhere else to go. And they were staying months and months, I mean 6, 7, 9 months. We had some individuals who were staying with us more than a year, because it's even harder sometimes for individuals who don't have children to find supportive housing. And we just really started to think about, how can we best support these clients who are coming to us, because their situation would stabilize, and because they'd have nowhere else to go, a lot of them started returning to an abusive situation because they really didn't have many options. And most people can only live in a shelter for so long. It's not meant to be a permanent living situation. So we slowly started to develop different housing programs. We initially started with a transitional housing program, which this idea was families would get their own apartment. They wouldn't have to share communal space with other people, and we would help subsidize their rent. And then the idea was it would be a short-term stay, and then they'd move on to some kind of permanent housing. And that model works well, but what we were finding is that even in a 12 or 18-month period, not all of our families were able to move on to permanent housing, even with that support. So that led us to take on an expansion of a housing program. And so that includes rapid rehousing, which is where we can help a client find their own apartment, and we subsidize the rent and provide supportive services. And then we now have a permanent supportive housing program where there's no time limit on how long the client can stay in the program, and we subsidize the rent, and they can also receive supportive services. So during this process, we grew out our supportive services as well. So our idea is we want to provide housing, subsidize rent as much as we can, but then also recognize our clients have experienced trauma, and a lot of them really need individualized approaches to help them get back on their feet. So we now have a clinical program with licensed clinicians, including a bilingual licensed clinician, which are hard to come by. We're very fortunate to have one on staff. And we also have other supportive services. We offer support groups, we offer individual advocacy in addition to the counseling, because not everyone is comfortable with counseling, but that is an option. We also have an immigration program, so we can work with undocumented victims, and we can provide them with legal assistance to help them obtain U visas and T visas if they're a victim of trafficking, and we've also done some asylum cases. If a victim were to go to a private attorney, that kind of legal representation will cost thousands of dollars and is often prohibitive for those that need that assistance. So we've built that out. We have 3 staff members who just work on legal immigration cases. And then we've built out other types of support. We work with children who come to us. Oftentimes children have witnessed violence in the home, and we know that children who witness violence are more at risk of becoming perpetrators or victims themselves.
Absolutely,
so
yes.
we talk a lot about how do we break that cycle, and we've built out some programming
Tell me a
around
little
that.
bit about that. Yeah, about that.
So we have a youth advocate on staff. We have a clinician who specifically works with children. And then we've also, the past few years, this is again another area of growth for us, we've started doing some school-based advocacy work where there's certain schools. We've always gone into schools and we'll do presentations about healthy dating and warning signs and sexual assault prevention, but we've really started to work more with schools, providing training to faculty members how to identify abuse. We've even done some programming, after school programming with students, service projects with students, helping them understand what warning signs are. We talk a lot about bystander intervention, how to work with your peers if you are experiencing, if you're witnessing someone in your peer group who might be in an abusive situation, how to respond to that. So we do a lot of training with students around that and develop programming around that. And in the summer, we offer a camp called Camp Eureka, which we've been running that camp for years now. But it's a free summer camp for children in our programs who have witnessed domestic violence, who normally wouldn't have the opportunity to go to summer camp. Mm-hmm. And we partner with Moses Brown, and high school students help implement the program. And they plan activities for the students for an entire week during the summer. And they do everything from make tie-dye shirts to go to the beach one day. And the kids just have an opportunity to have fun. Mm-hmm. And like I said, a lot of those children would not have the opportunity to attend a summer camp. And a lot of them look forward to it. They come back every year just for that.
What did you see happen during the pandemic?
The pandemic was very challenging for victim services agencies like Sojourner House. So immediately when lockdown happened, we started seeing an increase in requests to our hotline. So more people were calling, seeking emotional support, needing assistance with how to navigate the fact that many people were now literally stuck at home with their abuser.
They had no reprieve. The children didn't have a reprieve. Victims didn't have a reprieve.
They had nowhere to go. Mm-hmm. And the stories that we heard indicated that victims were in situations where violence was escalated. When you're stuck at home, there are just opportunities for violence to ensue. So we saw a lot of requests for help through a hotline. We saw a lot of requests for shelter and housing, so a lot of people wanted to escape from their abusive situation, again, had nowhere to go, especially during the pandemic. I mean, even a well-meaning friend during the height of lockdown didn't want to bring in their friend to sleep, even to sleep on their couch, which is something we often see. So there were a lot of requests for assistance for housing and shelter, and it was during that time period that we were able to secure additional funding to expand our housing and shelter footprint because the need was so great. We also distributed quite a bit of rental assistance, so there were some clients that we previously had helped them get safely housed, and then if you remember early on in the pandemic, there were economic repercussions. A lot of people lost their job temporarily, and so a lot of people were at risk of losing their housing, and so we were able to provide a lot of clients with rental assistance. We distributed over $400,000 just in rental assistance during the pandemic.
Wow.
Yes, and we felt really good about being able to help people who were already safely housed stay safely housed, because we were so worried about people losing their safe housing and then having to go through the whole cycle of trying to find supportive housing or affordable housing again. So that was, and that was a pivot for us. Prior to the pandemic, we hadn't provided a lot of rental assistance. There was more money available to nonprofits like Sojourner House to provide rental assistance, and it was greatly needed and very well utilized by our clients. So that was definitely a great resource. But we talked a lot, we thought there'd be this initial spike. I mentioned we saw more requests come to us for help, and we thought at some point there'd be this leveling off.
Yeah, leveling off?
And we haven't experienced the leveling off. I mean, we're 3 years out.
What do you think's going on?
Well, I think there was a lot of discussion during the pandemic, an acknowledgement of abuse as part of certain people's realities. And because there's greater awareness about domestic and sexual violence, more people feel comfortable coming forward and seeking help, which is certainly a great thing. Unfortunately, it means that agencies like Sojourner House are not always able to accommodate all the requests. So even though we have this growing housing program, on any given night we're providing housing to over 150 households, which is phenomenal. And again, when you think about when I started at the agency, we had one shelter. It's kind of amazing. But at the same time, we have 183 families on a waiting list who would like to access supportive housing. So even though we're doing more work than we've ever done before in our agency's history, we also have greater visibility, we get more referrals, and we have more people who are seeking our help. And I do think a lot of that is because there's more visibility now about this issue.
Okay. How many buildings do you have now? How many residential buildings?
So we have 7 residential buildings that we own, and we own 2 offices. And then we lease apartments from landlords throughout the state. Okay. But that is part of the work that we're doing. We want to acquire more properties that we can rehab and then lease to families.
Okay. You want to talk about the capital campaign?
Oh, yes. So we did purchase a building last year because our agency is growing so much and we have more staff and we need more office space. It's a mixed-use building, so it's 2 floors of office space, and then the 3rd floor is 2 apartments, which we will eventually use as affordable housing. It's in the west end of Providence. It's very accessible. It's right on Westminster Street, and we purchased it quickly because it's hard to find property now. And we purchased it with a mortgage, and so we're in the process of paying the mortgage off and creating an operating reserve. The building is beautiful, but it's old, so it has quite a bit of work that needs to be done to it, including a slate roof that needs a lot of repair.
Oh, I bet that's a pretty slate roof, though.
It is very nice. So we just launched a capital campaign, and we do have the generous support of the Champlin Foundation, which is a local Rhode Island foundation. They have given us an initial grant, and then they just gave us a challenge grant. So any funds we raise from now until October 31st, they're going to match up to $250,000 to put towards the building. So that's very generous of them. We want to take them up on their offer, make sure that we match every dollar of that $250,000.
Okay, so what are you doing for fundraising?
So we have a capital campaign committee. We are still recruiting individuals that might want to help us with that campaign, people who like to fundraise and connect us to networks. And then actually this week on Thursday, we're having an annual breakfast at the Providence Marriott downtown on Orm Street. And so that is an event we hold every year, and we present a few community awards. We have a survivor share their story, and then at this year's breakfast we are doing a pitch to our attendees to support the capital campaign. Okay. So that'll be happening this Thursday.
Okay, and then your largest fundraiser is your annual Masquerade Ball.
That is correct.
And that's November what?
17th.
November 17th.
So save the date.
We will.
And it is our largest fundraiser. It grows in size and scope every year. We have close to 400 people who attend the Masquerade Ball. It's at the Graduate Hotel. Wow. Yes, in downtown Providence. And we have a different theme every year. We haven't announced our theme for this year. But
can you give us a hint?
We usually announce it in June, so it'll be coming out soon. But we like to do a different theme so that people can dress in accordance with the theme. So that'll be coming soon.
Okay. Anything else that you want to say about your fundraising?
As much as we've grown through federal grants and even foundation support, we couldn't do this work without our community support. So fundraising is instrumental in making sure that we're able to do what we need to do in the community.
Okay. What can family and friends do or say? You know, so someone might come to you and say, I'm being hurt, or, you know, I have a feeling our friend is being hurt, or, you know what he's done to me. How should family and friends respond?
So if someone discloses abuse, we always say, believe them. And that's feedback we get from victims a lot, that when they do disclose abuse to a friend, to a family member, oftentimes people like to minimize the abuse, or people don't want to think badly about the abuser. Again, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, oftentimes abuse is hidden, it's in secret, other people don't know about it. Oftentimes abusers can have charming personalities, and so it can be difficult for other people to accept the fact that someone might be abusive. So the most important thing someone can do is, if someone discloses to you that they're experiencing abuse, believe them. Let them know you believe them. Let them know they can talk to you. Let them know that you're a resource. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know how to stop it. This is a public health epidemic. There are no easy solutions to how to stop abuse, but we can all be supportive friends and family members in this journey. And believing the victim, and then also recognizing not every person is ready to seek support or to seek help. And that's something else too. We often have well-meaning friends and family members come to us and say, my family member or my friend is experiencing abuse and they won't leave the situation. What can I do to make them leave? If we're talking about adults, you can't make anyone do anything they don't want to do. And oftentimes, if you present to someone this ultimatum that you have to leave your abusive partner, then they might pull away from you and they might not confide in you. And they probably need you as that support if they've disclosed the abuse in the first place. So believing the victim, supporting the victim, trying to not tell the victim what to do, and just listen. Oftentimes in our society, we're so quick to try to come up with a solution, but oftentimes what victims and survivors really need is they need someone to listen to them, and then they need space to figure out what's best for them, for their family.
We're down to 3 minutes.
Goes by fast.
It does go by fast. What else do you think it's important to share?
I think it's important for people to understand how many people are affected by domestic and sexual violence. Do
you have numbers?
So we know in Rhode Island that 1 out of 4 women will be a victim of domestic violence in her lifetime, and that's reported. So a lot of abuse is not reported.
Actually, would things change if it was reportable? There's no law really against emotional abuse or psychological abuse, right?
Right.
If a child reports to me that they're being hurt, or I suspect that they're being hurt, I can call someone. I can call the Department of Family Services. Adults, not so much though, right? It's not.
So when I say 1 out of 4 women in Rhode Island will be a victim of domestic violence, again, that is a small number compared to the amount of people who experience emotional abuse, psychological abuse that is not necessarily reported. So it affects a lot of people. And even if someone is not directly affected, if someone is not abused, I can guarantee that they know someone, a family member, a colleague, a friend who has experienced abuse. And oftentimes, those individuals don't disclose that they have experienced or are experiencing abuse. And so it's startling. It is startling how many people are affected by abusive relationships.
Okay, and the children. So what do you want to say about children who are witnessing domestic violence? So you do have some programs.
We do.
But what do you want to say about maybe their emotional growth or their psychological growth and the impact?
Well, we know that children who witness abuse are more likely to become perpetrators or victims. So the earlier we can intervene, the earlier that we can identify abuse that's happening in the household and then provide support to those children, the more successful their outcomes are going to be over the long term. But it really takes people stepping forward and intervening.
Okay. Thanks, Vanessa. We are down to seconds. We will leave Vanessa's contact info in our show notes. I'm Darlene DeRezzo. This is State of the State. Please find us on social media. We've just started a new Instagram account that is State of the State RI. Thanks.